The Rwandan Genocide is a relatively recent example of ethnic cleansing. I can imagine many of you have seen or at least heard about the film Hotel Rwanda, and you may even be aware of the barbarity of the crimes committed. It is an event in many of your lifetimes. But what may be less well known is the motivation of the various parties, the roles of the United Nations, and the historical background that formed the animosity between the majority Hutu and the minority Tutsi ethnic groups. The Rwandan Genocide was the result of a vast array of causes and had countless consequences for the region. In this video, we will attempt to explain the vast web of events that led to the genocide, and hopefully encourage you to look into this a little further. It is perhaps helpful to start by explaining the historical roles of the Tutsis and the Hutus. The Kingdom of Rwanda was originally ruled by the minority Tutsi aristocracy overseeing the majority Hutu, who were largely farm labourers. This is a generalisation, and of course, there were certain roles for Hutus in the Tutsi royal courts, and likewise, there were Tutsi peasants. But in terms of language, areas where they live, and traditions, the Hutus and the Tutsis are indistinguishable. In the 1800s, European Catholic missionaries entered the region. They often found it difficult to convert Tutsi elites, whilst having greater success with the Hutus. Rwanda was colonised by Germany in 1897, who brought with them the notions of race. The German colonists saw the Tutsi elite as racially superior to the Hutus, noting their taller stature, lighter skin, and capacity to rule. A simple explanation can be that the Tutsi tended to have access to milk and spent less time doing labour-intensive work. They tended to be taller and lighter skinned than the average Hutu. Nevertheless, Germany enlisted Tutsis to assist in managing colonial affairs based on their existing power structure. This combined with their European racial theories, some believing that the Tutsis were in fact from Ethiopia. Following from World War I and Germany's defeat, the Belgian government was given control over the Rwandan colony. The initial racial theories were expanded as the Belgian authorities applied eugenic principles. Skull size, skin tone, and height were used to compare the Tutsis and the Hutus. It was believed by the Belgians that the Tutsis were genetically superior and were given the lion's share of political power in Rwanda. The Hutu majority often were Catholics, meaning that the Hutu politician or goals were often supported and encouraged by the church. But it was the issuing of racial identity cards that would perhaps play the biggest role in the genocide to come. Each Rwandan was given an identity card determining their race. It was therefore very easy to tell whether a person was a Tutsi or a Hutu. Following World War II, the push for African independence spread across the continent. The majority Hutu population viewed the ruling Belgian and Tutsis as standing in the way of progress. As time progressed, the Belgian authorities, with encouragement from the Catholic Church, moved towards elections with Tutsi elites fearful of the outcome of any elections. In November of 1959, a Hutu leader was attacked by pro-monarchy Tutsi youths, and his death was falsely reported. The peaceful protests soon turned violent as some Catholic nationalist Hutus burned down Tutsi property. The Belgian colonial authorities were unable to prevent most of the violence, having only a few hundred soldiers stationed in Rwanda. Requests made by the Tutsis to form their own armed forces were denied by the Belgians, primarily fearing an escalation in the violence. But this was ignored, as the Tutsi and Hutu militias clashed. A mass exodus of Tutsis fled into neighbouring Uganda and Burundi. Elections were eventually held in 1960 in a bid to move Rwanda towards independence as soon as possible. The election was a massive success for the Party of the Hutu Emancipation, its leader, Gregoire Kiabandi, being the country's first elected president. During the early years of Rwanda's independence, it had to contend with regular attacks from Tutsi rebels who would launch strikes from Uganda and Burundi, and the ever-present ethnic violence between Tutsi and Hutu. Kiabandi was eventually overthrown by his army chief of staff, Juvenal Habyarimana. Habyarimana would rule Rwanda as a dictator. He did little to deal with the tens of thousands of Tutsi refugees in Uganda and Burundi who wished to return to Rwanda. In 1981, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF, was established, a nationalist group with aims of returning to Rwanda. Many of its members fought in the Ugandan Bush War, earning them experience as guerrilla fighters. In October of 1990, hundreds of RPF rebels stormed the Rwandan border, dressed in stolen Ugandan army uniforms and armed with stolen Ugandan weaponry. They were faced with a much larger and better equipped Rwandan armed forces. French and Belgian soldiers were soon dispatched to protect the Europeans living in Rwanda as the civil war began. From the Virunga Mountains, its leader Paul Kagame organised the RPF to fight a guerrilla war and kept pressure on Habyarimana. In 1993, the RPF made some territory gains, and in August of 1993, an uneasy peace was reached between the Rwandan government and the RPF. UN forces were sent into the country to maintain the peace and ensure the peace accords were followed. Despite the peace, there was still the ever-present threat of the violence against the Tutsis. Radio stations and Catholic priests during their sermons would often refer to the Tutsis as cockroaches, hinting that the time would come when they must be dealt with. On January 11th, 1994, the commander of the UN peacekeeping forces, Romeo Dallaire, sent a fax to the UN headquarters. He told his superiors that he was in contact with a top-level trainer in the cadre of Interahamwe armed militia. The Interahamwe were a paramilitary group linked to Habyarimana's government. This informant claimed to have been ordered to register all of the Tutsis in the capital city of Kigali. The informant suspected that the genocide against the Tutsis was being planned, and he said that in 20 minutes his personnel could kill up to 1,000 Tutsis. Dallaire's request to protect the informant and to carry out raids on the suspected weapon stashes were denied by the UN. In April of 1994, the fragile peace was shattered. President Habyarimana's plane was shot down. To this day, it's not entirely clear who was responsible. Some believe it was the RPF who carried out the attack, eager to continue the war, as it was clear that Habyarimana was not moving fast enough to implement the terms of the peace accord. Other people lay the blame at the Hutu members of Habyarimana's government, who were not willing to give any political ground to the Tutsi rebels. Either way, this event triggered the Rwandan Genocide. The Ugandan military refused to accept Agatha Uwilingiyimana, the Prime Minister who was next in line to be president. The UN commander in Rwanda, Romeo Dallaire, urged the military and hardline Hutus to accept Agatha as the new president, but he was unable to do so. In response, a unit of 10 Belgian UN soldiers was sent to protect Agatha and arrange for her to address the nation in a call for peace. After the radio broadcast, Agatha and her family were attacked by soldiers from the Presidential Guard. The 10 Belgian soldiers were captured, tortured, and hacked to death with machetes, a weapon that would become synonymous with the genocide. Agatha and her husband were both murdered. This was but the start, as Hutu extremists attacked and murdered hundreds of moderate Hutu politicians and people in positions of power. In response, the Belgian government withdrew its remaining troops, and the UN ordered that its peacekeepers only protect themselves and not the Tutsi or moderate Hutu populations. The very next day, Hutu Interahamwe, led by the Presidential Guard, began the genocide of the Tutsi people in the capital. At its peak, the Interahamwe murdered 30,000 people, mainly young men armed with machetes. The weapon caches were opened as thousands of armed men set about murdering their neighbours. Roadblocks were set up across the city, with anyone wishing to pass through having to show their identity cards. Those marked as Tutsi were immediately killed. Bands of armed men went from house to house, searching for Tutsis, burning and looting as they went. In a bid to encourage ordinary citizens to take part in the violence, the state would offer food, alcohol, and money. In some instances, they were offered the property of the Tutsis that they killed. The use of radio broadcast spread messages of hate and fear to the populations. Before the genocide, the channels would broadcast hateful songs and slogans, hinting that soon the time would come to deal with the Tutsis. When the genocide started, the infamous phrase, "cut down all the trees," was repeated throughout the radio. The phrase was coded language to mean slaughter the taller Tutsis with machetes. A common method of massacres was committed in churches or schools. Over the course of 2 days at the Narrabwi church, 20,000 people were murdered. At Gikondo, approximately 100 children were hacked to death as they tried to hide in a Polish-run church. At Natarama Church, some 5,000 people seeking refuge were executed. Very often, the Catholic priests would notify the Interahamwe forces of where the Tutsis were hiding. Perhaps the best example of this method was the massacres that took place at the Murumbi Technical School. Tutsis in the area fled to the local churches, but they were advised by the bishop to seek shelter at the Murumbi Technical School. They were told that there were some French soldiers there that would protect them. The bishop was actually luring people into a trap. Approximately 50,000 to 65,000 people made their way to seek shelter in the school's many buildings. Upon arrival, they found themselves in a dire situation. There was no water, no electricity, and little food. Marauding bands of murderous militias attacked the school, keeping the Tutsis inside. The 4 soldiers at the school left on the 17th of April. On the 18th of April, the Interahamwe militia arrived by the truckload. The Tutsis inside the school were able to hold them off for a day or two, but by the 21st of April, the school was completely surrounded and the shootings began. Men armed with machetes and axes began to search the buildings, murdering as they went. The bodies were buried in mass graves covered in lime. It's thought that only 34 people managed to survive the massacre at Murumbi. The complex is now a memorial where the preserved bodies of the victims are kept on display. Rooms are devoted to the various victims, with truly shocking rooms housing the remains, one of them even displaying the remains of babies who were buried in mass graves. The Rwandan Genocide is unfortunately synonymous with SA. The propaganda portrayed Tutsi women as untrustworthy and a seductive force working against the country. Assaults were used as a weapon against the Tutsi population, with assault squads formed of men suffering with AIDS. These squads were unleashed on Tutsi women to inflict horrific suffering. The goal was to kill off the population with a long and painful disease. Mutilation was common, often with machetes, sharpened sticks, or acid. Reproductive systems were targeted and mutilated, with a goal to stop the birth of any more Tutsis. Women would be held against their will into sexual slavery, with Hutu women acting as guards. Thousands of children were conceived through these assaults. Their mothers, unable to know from the hundreds of men who violated them which one fathered the child. Hundreds of thousands of women were systematically assaulted in this manner, as such abuses were weaponized. Although it is well remembered that the Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed, members of the Twa ethnic group are often the forgotten victims, making up less than 1% of the population and numbering 30,000 at the start of the genocide. The Twa are one of the oldest ethnic groups in Rwanda. These people were traditionally forest dwellers, though their lands were systematically taken in the 1970s and 80s. Due to some of the Twa taking roles in the Tutsi royal court, there was a perception by some Hutus that the Twa were sympathetic to the Tutsis. As a result, 10,000 Twa were murdered, with many more escaping as refugees. However, in some areas, the Twa did engage in the genocide, murdering Tutsis in a bid to show loyalty to the regime. The RPF were not idle as the genocide raged. Within a few days of Habyarimana's death, it was clear that the Tutsis were being massacred. The RPF renewed their attacks, aiming to surround the capital as soon as possible. With the Hutu leadership distracted by the genocide they were committing, the RPF faced little resistance. In a grim mirror to the Tutsi exodus, Hutu refugees fled Rwanda as the RPF steamrolled their way through Rwanda. The leader of the RPF, Paul Kagame, refused to engage in discussion with the interim Hutu government, believing that they had no intention in stopping the genocide. Between the 7th of April and the 15th of July, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people had been killed, with tens of thousands of women being victims of SA, with the awful consequences of venereal disease, unwanted pregnancies, and the spreading of HIV/AIDS. The RPF forces committed several reprisals against Hutu civilians, with an estimated 30,000 Hutus killed during the civil war. A notable example being at the Kabiho refugee camp. Approximately 2 million Hutus fled into neighbouring Zaire, many targeted in a prelude to the First Congo War. An estimated 1 million people were in some way culpable for the genocide. Prisons were overcrowded as over 100,000 people were jailed. Paul Kagame became the vice president and head of the army of the new government, eventually becoming the president on the 22nd of April 2000. A new constitution was established, which forbids the use of ethnic distinctions. The new government has been encouraging reconciling between the two communities. One of the more interesting approaches has been the Gacaca courts, a grassroots court system where perpetrators and victims sat together to discuss what had happened. Over 1.2 million cases were heard by these courts, overseen by trusted members of the community. Whether or not this is suitable in the face of such violent crimes, the goal was to offer a sense of closure to the victims. Due to the vast number of perpetrators, it would take hundreds of years to carry out the criminal trials, especially when lawyers and judges too were victims of the genocide. The Gacaca court system is a controversial subject, which could be celebrated as showing the importance of restorative justice, or be seen as a way to give political legitimacy to the new government. There are many factors to try and understand the cause of the genocide. The implementation of racial divisions by the German and Belgian colonial powers fermented the divide between the Tutsi and Hutu. And then there's the role of the radio stations and Catholic Church in spreading the message of hate to the population, whipping them into a frenzy. And then, the lack of any meaningful response from the United Nations and their refusal to listen to Romeo Delaire's warnings. The lack of response are undoubtedly failures that deserve to haunt the United Nations. The speed in which the genocide started can only be explained by a long-standing plan to murder the Tutsi and moderate Hutus. But, without the combination of the state-sanctioned violence and years of ingrained ethnic division, the widespread participation of the Hutu population would likely not have been possible. Modern-day Rwandans now must reconcile their violent past, which is truly an unenviable task. The Rwandan genocide is a somber reminder of the dangers of focusing on what can divide us rather than what unites us.